Okay, go ahead, Deva.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining today's Zoom meeting. We'll be discussing Pluto and aspects to planets, stressful and non-stressful. And the core of the discussion will be centering upon the Pluto's aspects from an evolutionary point of view. How do we understand what Pluto aspects mean? What do they symbolize in the birth chart? How do we understand the difference between a stressful and non-stressful aspects? And as always, I like to make these discussions as participation oriented as possible. So the way that, from my view, it works the best is to ask a question right when you have it, to make sure everybody's on the same page. In my view, there are no stupid questions. So please don't hesitate. If there are dynamics that come to mind, questions that come to mind, feel free to jump in. In my experience, when we have a group discussion and also collaborate in terms of looking at birth charts, I feel that we come to a much more comprehensive understanding of whatever topic is being discussed. So just some encouragement to jump in. With that, let's go ahead and dive into our topic for this Zoom meeting. First, we'll recap the Pluto paradigm. In terms of orienting towards the birth chart using the evolutionary astrology method, or the Pluto paradigm, the first symbol that we start with is Pluto. And what Pluto symbolizes is the soul's prior evolutionary intentions. When you look at natal Pluto by house and sign, it symbolizes the soul, where the soul has where the soul is naturally gravitated to in other lifetimes for security reasons and for its own evolutionary purposes. So there's going to be a natural pickup point in this life where the soul is left off in other lifetimes, and where the soul will naturally pick up in terms of an overall orientation in this life. From there, we move to the south node, the south node of the moon. And the south node symbolizes the soul's prior egocentric structure, that it is created in order to actualize its prior life evolutionary intentions, symbolized by Pluto. So already there's a relationship, or there's a relationship between Pluto and the south node. The south node is an actualizer, or it's a mode of operation in order for Pluto to actualize itself. And from there, we move to the planetary ruler of the south node. To determine its ruler, you look to the sign. So for example, if we're looking at the south node being in Scorpio, Pluto, the planet Pluto itself, would be the ruler of the south node. And just as the south node has acted as a facilitator or mode of operation for Pluto to actualize itself, so too does the south node act as a ruler, or act as a actualizer for the south node to actualize itself. So we're seeing there's a relationship here between Pluto, the south node, and its ruler. From my understanding, looking at these three symbols, Pluto, south node, and its ruler, you could really term those the trinity of the past. Because when you take those symbols in total, it's going to represent the soul's emotional body in total, past life dynamics, what the soul is going to orient to for a conscious and unconscious sense of security. The moon represents emotional security from an egocentric or conscious level, while Pluto represents security from an unconscious level. From there, we move to Pluto's polarity point. And when you look at Pluto's polarity point, it symbolizes the current evolutionary intentions for the life. The polarity point doesn't have a specific symbol on the birth chart, but it's the opposite house and sign of natal Pluto. So for example, if you have natal Pluto in Scorpio in the 3rd house, the polarity point to that is going to be Taurus in the 9th house. And what that symbolizes is the current evolutionary intentions for the life, that by embracing the opposite house and sign of Pluto, there's going to be an automatic regeneration or rebirthing of the natal Pluto itself. And this is because typically when we're looking at the natal position of Pluto, we're going to see where the soul has become, it also symbolizes points of limitation, stagnation, non-growth, habitual patterns of behavior, and it can also at times symbolize compulsions. And those represent clear limitations relative to ongoing growth. So when we're looking at Pluto's polarity point, it symbolizes pathways we can take to evolve or to metamorphose out of the limitations that are symbolized by Pluto's natal position. So again, things are not stagnant, that there's a continual momentum, or that there's a circuit of energy that's created by these symbols. And again, that it's not moving away from one symbol and going towards another, which can be a common misunderstanding, is creating that circuit of energy, or it's seeing the relationship between these symbols. Again, by embracing the opposite, or by embracing Pluto's polarity point, there's an automatic regeneration, regrowth of the natal position of Pluto. So when looking at these symbols, it's important to understand how they interact, how they create a circuit of energy, and how by seeing the pathways that can lead to a breaking free of habits and breaking free of limitations, there's an automatic regeneration that typically occurs. So from that, moving into the North Node then, from Pluto's polarity point, the North Node is the North Node of the Moon, is going to symbolize the evolving or the forming egocentric structure of the soul. It's the egocentric structure that the soul is creating in order to actualize its current evolutionary intentions. And just as the South Node became a mode of operation for Pluto to actualize itself, same relationship between the North Node and Pluto. Pluto's polarity point, Pluto's polarity point is going to use the North Node to actualize itself, and then look to the ruler of the North Node. And that's how the North Node is going to develop itself. And again, look to the sign. If the North Node then was in Taurus, you would look to Venus as the planetary ruler to see how that North Node is going to actualize itself. So we have to understand Pluto aspects in relation to the Pluto paradigm. You can understand core intentions, you can understand core themes of an isolated Pluto aspect, but to really see what it means for any given soul, of course you need to have the birth chart, the paradigm, putting it in the correct context or individual context. So with that, any questions, any thoughts? Okay, so moving on from there then, moving on to the 3 reactions to evolutionary growth. These are very, this topic is connected to Pluto aspects in that it's our own cooperation or resistance that will determine how any Pluto aspect is experienced. If we make a choice, which is by far the most uncommon, to totally resist the evolutionary changes that Pluto aspects are asking or are symbolizing or needed, then we can experience Pluto aspects very difficult, challenging, overall negative ways, and in the end those can bring about the necessary changes. But typically it's a resistance to the changes that Pluto aspects are asking that can create more of an intensity than needed, or can create situations that may not have had to been as negative or as stressful. Or we can make a choice, which is by far the most common, to cooperate in some ways, and in other ways say not cooperate. Say I'll change in this way, or I'll change this much, but not in other ways. And then the third, which is to totally go for it, and that's also not common, but especially when experiencing Pluto aspects that are more difficult, or even Pluto transits, times that are most difficult, trying to motivate oneself to take a stance of doing whatever needs to be done during that period. It can create very beneficial outcomes, in the sense of alleviating very stressful karmic conditions, even though it's very difficult, challenging work. It's kind of playing the end game, if that makes sense, or playing the, what do they call it, playing the long game. um, so trying to motivate oneself to be willing to change in whatever ways are necessary during the most stressful times. And it is our reaction to the necessary evolutionary change that will determine, again, how any Pluto aspect or how any transit will be experienced and what's unfold. At times we can create situations that lessens the intensity of experiences, lessens the duration of intense experiences, can counteract, can turn things into a positive. And to share with you, that's been some of the most helpful advice I've ever received, is when encountered with a negative experience, to always try and make things a positive. Or when working with situations that are very Plutonian intense, how to turn a situation that seems to be only full of negative, or only full of very stressful situations, trying to create a positive outcome, trying to see the positives that can come out of it. Those can be ways to focus upon potentially what can happen for the future. Pluto aspects are lifelong. Pluto transits are for a long duration, but it's focusing more on the benefits, the positives that can come out, trying to focus on those. So trying to make a positive out of a negative, as basic as it seems, can recenter consciousness, or can recenter in terms of working with, again, the more challenging dynamics that can come up. So any questions so far? Any additions? Any thoughts? Okay, then we'll move on to the next slide. So looking at this, that the difference between a stressful and non-stressful aspect. The non-stressful aspects are in blue. The stressful aspects are in red. So looking at the orbs, 10-degree orbs for conjunctions, squares, trines, oppositions, 5 degrees for sesquiquadrate, in conjunction, sesquiquadrate, and these in conjunctions here, because there's 2 different kinds, depending on phase. So the most important is, at least from my point of view, when you're looking at these, is to not make any generalizations that, okay, so I'm looking at a Pluto aspect that's a stressful one. It's in opposition. Does that mean that these are going to play out in ways that are negative? Does that make it a bad aspect? Does that trying to get away from this positive negative? Because looking at this, these are gateways. These are specific gateways that the soul needs to pass through, and that when you make it through the gateways, the growth that's needed to happen does make its way forward. So it's like a way of saying that no aspect is inherently positive or negative, whether it's stressful or non-stressful, but it's how we use that energy at any given time. Breaking through gateways that can create very positive opportunities in the future, that can help very Pluto-ridden or very intense dynamics that have been carried forward from the past to eventually find a relief point. So these gateways, I guess it's transitioning more into the thought process of opportunities, and seeing these different uh, stressful and non-stressful aspects as different gateways, again, that the soul has opportunities to pass through, that there's inherent energies available. As an example, the opposition, from what I've learned, is an opportunity to throw something off. So it's not to be met with fear in that sense, but it's a way of encouraging and to also make the most of the energy that is available, however stressful it may be. Being able to throw something off can be quite liberating. For me, it holds a Uranian feel. So encouraging when you look at these and you're going through an intense Pluto transit, or if you find that the Pluto aspects in your chart are emphasized, looking for perspective, or looking for ways to handle the more intense energies. It's to really look for opportunities to use these energies at their maximum. And for stressful aspects, the tension can be a positive thing, because the tension that the stressful aspects bring up naturally create momentum, pressure to change, whereas the non-stressful aspects can bring up dynamics of resistance to growth. So seeing these as gateways, trying to use opportunities that are at its most available. For example, the trine, it would really be encouraging the person to, from my point of view, to put into motion or to put into action things that they're conscious of. Because that trine, yes, that person can be very aware, or can be full of potential. That trine usually symbolizes creative actualization of potential and so on. But if that soul isn't acting on that, or if they're resisting the knowledge that they have, it can become a stressful aspect, or it can become stressful through transit, through progression. So it's kind of a Mars feeling, but it's encouraging that person again to act upon that knowledge, to make the most of the energy that's available in that trine. So really trying to move away from positive, negative, and seeing it more as opportunities, potentials, that there's energies available in any given aspect, and it's to make the most of them. Um, any questions so far? Okay. So I'm thinking the next slide then is how to determine a Pluto aspect, or how to determine the phase and the degrees of separation of any given planet. I do believe, is that the next slide?
Yes, this is the example.
Okay. So if we're trying to determine a specific Pluto aspect, then what we'll do is we'll start, could we move to the next slide, please?
I think there's a bit of a delay, so it should be popping up really.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, we are on the next slide, Deva. It was similar to the previous slide, but this one is an example of the moon sextile Pluto.
Let's see, why is it not? Now it's popping up. Thank you. There was a delay here.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, thank you. So when we're trying to determine a Pluto aspect, start with Pluto as the slower moving planet, and then count counterclockwise. So in this example, we're looking at a Moon-Pluto aspect. You start with Pluto and then count counterclockwise to the Moon. The only exception to the rule is the Sun. The Sun is always the baseline, or the Sun is always the starting point for determining aspects. So looking at this in terms of the degrees of separation, we're going to start with Pluto at the 0 degree conjunction, and then we're going to move to a 60-degree sextile, 60 degrees second crescent phase sextile, starting with Pluto and then moving counterclockwise. So in this case, if Pluto and the Moon were in this position, again, you would see a crescent phase sextile. So are there any questions about how to determine Pluto aspect in terms of calculating the degree of separation? Okay. And with this, in terms of how evolution, or in terms of how these stressful and non-stressful aspects will typically be experienced, that typically evolution occurs in either cataclysmic or non-cataclysmic ways. Cataclysmic evolution is quick and sudden change that occurs in a short amount of time. So this type of evolution, cataclysmic evolution, can be like what we're experiencing now, the sudden pandemic. It can be situations of sudden loss, sudden situations where you have to act, or that there's not a lot of time to adjust to the change. And it's similar to a volcano that can suddenly erupt. It creates a lot of change in a short amount of time. So typically when we're looking at stressful aspects, the conjunction, the square, the inconjunction, and opposition, typically stressful aspects correlate with cataclysmic evolution. And this is because the soul is typically, and I think it's more that the soul is unconscious. The soul is not conscious of the changes that are needed. It's typically unconscious to the soul. And so again, the positive effects of the stressful aspects can be igniting or inducing the necessary tension or stress so that the need for change becomes conscious. And sometimes the soul can program that it really doesn't have any option to change. And that's typically how cataclysmic evolution works, is that we program situations to where there's no way to sustain patterns of the past. And when we're going through it, it's not typically our emotions. Our emotions are saying, well, wait a minute, Scorpio can definitely not feel ready for the change. I don't feel I've been given enough time. But nonetheless, the rug gets pulled out, or we create situations where we have no choice but to. And that's because the soul's desire to grow, the soul's desire to metamorphose beyond past limitations has become stronger than the resistance. The evolutionary pace, when you see a number of Pluto aspects, whether they're stressful or non-stressful, it indicates that the soul has picked an accelerated evolutionary path. So if you're looking at a birth chart and you see a high degree of Pluto aspects, that soul typically has programmed a lot of growth, not a lot of rest, but typically a life where there's been a lot of change, whether it's slow and progressive or cataclysmic. So it accelerates the evolutionary pace. So when you're looking at stressful aspects, it's typically creating enough stress or tension in the soul's life to where the need for change becomes conscious, and that they can program situations to where there is no choice but to change after the event itself. So any questions, any input, any thoughts about what we've discussed so far?
Yes, Deva. When you're having a very stressful Pluto transit, when does it become conscious? Because very often, we have no clue as to why. So when do you think it would become conscious?
Oh, that's a great question. So typically when in the process of the Pluto transit or Pluto aspects do the necessary changes become conscious?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a great question. And typically, from what I've experienced, if it's a transit, it's typically after the first retrograde. So we go through the first pass of it, and it's exactly what you're saying, that either we didn't feel ready for it, we're not understanding what's going on, we don't know the why. And then through the retrograde, the intensity backs off a little bit. It's a time of reflection. It's a time of trying to consciously understood what just happened here, so that we're potentially more ready than we were in the initial pass. So through transit, from my experience, it's been after Pluto goes retrograde the first time. And if it's through a natal Pluto aspect, I would say the first Saturn return really kicks a lot of things on in terms of consciously understanding things and the ability to really work with whatever the intentions are, because it symbolizes a gateway in and of itself. So it can come through key transits that we become more aware, that we start understanding the why more than we did. So that I would say if it's the first Saturn return can create more of an awareness of that. I would say too, there can be key transits that can, let's say, if you have a Pluto aspect to Venus, and then um, let's say Pluto through transit is activating that Venus. That can bring an awareness of why. So if it's a natal aspect, key transits or progressions can bring about that awareness more consciously than in other times of life. Jupiter too, the first Jupiter, I think it's at 21. Is that the first Jupiter square? Um, so it just really depends on what natal Pluto aspects you have relative to these key transits and key progressions.
Okay, Deva, I do have another question.
Mm-hmm.
Just say I've gone through a really stressful Pluto transit and I've been through all the hits, either 3 or 5, and all the retrogrades, and Pluto's now moving forward, but I still don't understand why it happened. Could it be that the reason could be just to understand that life is difficult? It's not always going to be easy. What do you think?
Yeah, that sometimes you can understand what you need to know through those hits and through the retrogrades, and then it can progressively. Sometimes, sometimes there is no resolution, depending on the circumstances. As Scorpio as that sounds, in terms of what are words for that? Some things are unresolvable. And again, I want to be careful with the language here, but depending on the circumstance, it's almost like, how does that saying go? Sometimes you just have to move forwards. And there really is no other, there really is no other way to navigate it other than that. And then I would say that what you need to know, you will know through through those passes. So it may be that there's never a full resolution, but what you need to understand in terms of the ability to move forward, those parts of it will become conscious.
Thanks, Deva. And another saying would be that transformation is hard work. So it's not easy.
Exactly.
Right. Thank you.
Deva, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, this is Linda. I've been watching your videos for a long time. Thank you for all your teaching. I had a question from the beginning of your presentation about determining the mode of operation with the nodes. We're to look to the sign and not the house. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay, great. I just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you. So thanks, guys, for jumping in. Any more questions about Pluto aspects, Pluto progressions, cataclysmic evolution? And again, I guess to reiterate kind of the core points, at least from my point of view, is that so often I think that whether we're conscious of it or not, we can tend to look at trines or look at the more non-stressful aspects of the chart and think, oh, great, this is going to manifest in an easy breezy positive way. And we tend to look at the stressful aspects as, oh no, and where's the relief to that? And so I'd really like to emphasize here that it's the necessary stress, or that with those stressful aspects, to really try to encourage in yourself and others the knowledge that the stress can be used in positive ways. Sometimes it's necessary to get it going. Or if there wasn't the stress, then we would find that we are more prone to just letting things be. And sometimes that can't be. Sometimes that there needs to be that amount of stress to induce or to make the soul aware of what needs to change at certain key moments in time. So to promote that knowledge that stress can be used in positive ways.
Deva, what about stagnation? Is it true that the soul does not like stagnation? It doesn't really like things to remain the same for a very long time, and that it's just keeps moving us forward?
Absolutely, that can be, even though it might not seem so, experiencing a prolonged sense of stagnation can be very cataclysmic. Like there's no progression, there's no growth, even if it's monotony, that can just seem to just keep going. So yes, the soul does not like stagnation, and that's a Pluto issue, and that's another way. Thank you for addressing that. That's another way that stressful aspects can take place, is they can take place through an experience of stagnation, that the soul can become aware of. Can become aware of a block or limitation, but it's not consciously aware of the source of the block. So it can become very introverted to try and to cover or detect in a very Scorpio way, try and get to the bottom line of what is this stagnation about? Why is it happening? What can I do about it? So it's like it's trying to bore it more conscious, or it's like it's trying to open up the awareness of what's creating the stagnation. And that can take, it can take those 3-4 different passes. until the soul can understand, or it can take that amount of time to bring the awareness or to bring that into more consciousness, or into more of an understanding of what's creating the block, the stagnation, and so on. So yeah, that is a definite uh, form of cataclysmic evolution from my point of view, and that the soul can experience that as a type of cataclysm, because of the emotional intensity of it. Again, great participation. Thanks. Any more questions as we move forward? So when we look at the non-stressful aspects, typically it manifests as uniform or non-cataclysmic evolution. That's slow and progressive change. There is total change, but it happens over a longer period of time. It's similar to a mountain that's eroding over time. That again, there's total change, just as in cataclysmic change, but that it happens over a progressive period. And when we're looking at the non-stressful aspects, it does indicate that the soul is typically conscious of the changes that need to be made, and can it manifests in a more smooth, progressive, continual way. However, when we look at these non-stressful aspects, there can be a tendency to resist, or to, because of the lack of stress, it can create like an inertia, not making the necessary changes when needed to. And again, over time, the non-stressful aspects can become stressful through transit or progression. So the key to this, or the key to working with the non-stressful aspects, at least from my point of view, is to put into motion, or is to act upon what the soul is aware of, in order to make the most of those non-stressful aspects, and to do that over a progressive period. Again, it's like that mountain that progressively erodes down over time. Consistency, in order to create, to maximize the effect of the transformation that Pluto aspect can bring. So when we're looking at the semi-sextile, the septile, the trine, and so on, it's to really encourage, or it's to really make the most by applying the changes that the soul knows needs to be made at that time. And in that way, the growth that can be affected is quite tremendous, because it's almost like the ability to integrate, the ability to consciously work with the changes as they're occurring is unsurpassed. That's the momentum that those Pluto non-stressful aspects can have. So again, it's making the most of the opportunities of the energies that are available in those Pluto aspects. Any thoughts or any questions about non-cataclysmic growth, non-stressful aspects? And again, when we look at the natal chart and we see a high degree of Pluto aspects, whether they're stressful or non-stressful, we can orient towards that chart knowing that that soul has picked an accelerated growth path in that life. And whether it's because the soul has had a lack of Pluto aspects prior to the life, but it's not to judge as one, one chart being better or one chart being like, I guess the reason I'm communicating this is because quite often people can look at a chart that's highly aspected by Pluto and go, oh no, gosh, is this a difficult chart, not difficult chart? And it's more about what that soul has chosen for itself. And sometimes the soul is just desiring to get on with things, so to speak. Andale, andale. They want things to go quicker. So they can pick a chart that has an accelerated growth path. And other times it's to offset perhaps having a lifetime or two where there was very little change or only the minimal amount. So the soul is picking a life again to pick up the pace, to make changes that weren't made in other lifetimes in a quicker way to accelerate the growth path. So it's to offset, I would say, perhaps lifetimes where there wasn't accelerated growth happening or where there was a lack of pressure to do that. So it's looking at it more as the soul desiring again to move forwards, to create a lot of change as quickly as it can when you see a lot of Pluto aspects. So to approach it more from that standpoint, and to see it as the soul desiring again to move on, or the soul desiring to accomplish a lot of growth in one lifetime. And so to encourage that knowledge, because typically souls with a lot of Pluto transit or Pluto aspects in their chart will report a lot of change, a lot of metamorphic events, not a lot of experience of whether it's not wanting to stay stagnant, always wanting to move forwards, those kind of things. So any questions so far? Any thoughts about that before we move on? Okay. So I guess the best, yeah, again, it's we all want to know the why. We all want to understand why things are happening. And whether it's through a stressful or non-stressful aspect, focusing in upon the why, whether it's seeing that maybe the why won't totally be understood until another point in time, a little later within that Pluto aspect or Pluto transit, but that can be the integration point to the changes that need to be made. From my experience and to share with you, it's when there's a tendency for victimization, or there can be a tendency to get lost in the nature of the intensity. Some can experience catatonia, and because what it brings up can be just so intense, so Plutonian. So as much as possible, working with the integration point of the why. Even if it's as basic as, I'm going to turn this into a positive. I don't know how yet, but I'm determined to make this negative thing a positive thing in whatever simple way I can. Even that's moving forward. So it's not to get lost in the intensity of the experience, the negativity, but is to keep moving things in a positive direction, to try and give it a good outlet to come through, counteracting the negativity through potentials that can come through it, and so on. Yes, and so the key is to understanding the why this is being experienced and what can be done. So in terms of motivation, even if it's, again, making efforts to turn something that's negative into a positive, that can already be demonstrating an understanding of why, even if it's unconscious. Or that can be demonstrating an understanding that it was experienced for a reason, whether that why is known at that time or not. So any questions so far? Any input?
Yes, Deva, regarding the coronavirus, is Pluto forcing the collective of souls to enter upon reflection as to why this is happening?
I could definitely agree with that in many ways. Also seeing the Uranus going into Taurus, the trauma relative to survival, having to create new technology. A lot of things are now becoming through internet, distance learning, necessary lifestyle changes that may come through it. So yes, I could definitely see that, and potentially having us reflect upon what we need for survival, or affecting resources that can also be used for survival of the whole. So I can see it as also creating new technology, perhaps, that will be good for us in the long run. At least that's my hope at the time. So yes, very much reflecting upon why this is happening, enforcing some lifestyle changes relative to underlying need for survival.
Great, thanks, Deva.
So yeah, I guess the best is to apply these principles through chart example. And looking at our first example, Carl Jung, I would put him in the third stage individuated. And he has a Pluto Moon balsamic conjunction. Looking at the degrees of separation, counting counterclockwise, Pluto starting at 23, the Moon at 15 Taurus. The South Node then being Libra in the 8th house, ruled by Venus in Cancer, conjunct Mercury. North Node being Aries in the 2nd, and Pluto's polarity point being in Scorpio in the 9th house. So looking at this, what stuck out, at least to me, in terms of the specific Moon-Pluto conjunction, so when you look at Moon-Pluto, it's the evolutionary intent is to bring about internal security versus external security. A lot of reflection upon external sources of security, the self-image. One of the more difficult experiences of Pluto-Moon aspects. This could also be true if you have a high degree of 4th house or Cancer energy in your birth chart. It's essentially needing to support yourself emotionally from the inside, not being taken care of in the ways that you need. So it's enforcing a sense of internal security through removal of a lot of external security factors. And in this case, it's interesting how it played out for him, because he has South Node then being in Libra in the 8th house. And at first, he was very connected to Freud. He was his model student. Freud used him as an example, as his protege. And looking at this Pluto Moon, South Node in Libra in the 8th, seeing the emulation, or seeing the security with emulating somebody else, seeing that South Node in Libra, trying to create the harmony, trying to create the peace. And yet the natural tension that happened when he broke out of that, when he deepened his psychological knowledge, Pluto's polarity point, Scorpio in the 9th house, relative to more esoteric. I mean, he introduced the psychology of individuation. And look at that, the Mars being in Sagittarius in the 11th, which then makes a wide trine to this Uranus in the 7th. But look at how he broke away from that. How he broke away from this kind of model, or the emulating somebody who was very much a figure to create emotional security. And he broke into his own. He broke into his own niche. He broke into his own vision. Um, North Pluto's polarity point being in Scorpio on the 9th, transmuting this sense of perhaps emulating or finding security through interconnecting with those who at once he'd been close with, even if it was a prior life. And seeing the North Node being in Aries in the 2nd house, establishing his own voice in the field through differing. And he was with the South Node in Libra, the confrontation, having to become emotionally secure with the wedge, was trusting his own voice in comparison to the security through being known kind of through Freud, or through this figure. And seeing this Venus Mercury in Cancer in the 6th house, his own voice, that he was in himself, in his own terms. He said there's deepening here to do. That was his main critique, 6th house of the Freudian work, was that there was a unconscious that needed to be developed. And look at the Scorpio energy, Pluto's polarity point being in Scorpio, the deepening. So the tension or the conflict that it brought up was in a balsamic phase, how he became secure within himself to develop his psychological work in his own right. I would see that coming through the North Node being in Aries, ruled by Mars and Sagittarius in the 11th, his own vision, but that coming through the insecurity of conflict, and being able to hold his own, or to try and do it as diplomatically as possible. But how does that saying go? At bare minimum, agree to disagree. And whatever that meant is what it meant. And then becoming established in his own right. Seeing the Saturn in Aquarius in the 1st house. And it, it's out of orb to Uranus. But looking at the Uranus and Leo in the 7th, seeing a potential trauma or a potential conflict with what people who are well known, with his own creative actualization process. And seeing that it makes a sextile, Saturn makes a sextile back to Mars. So the psychology of individuation, Saturn in Aquarius in the 1st house retrograde, his own path, his own vision, breaking away from something that was known, established, internal security to do that, and how that affected his self-image. In the end, gosh, I think I remember reading that during one of their talks, and their dialogues could be super intense in terms of the emotional charge, Moon Pluto, that to bring some lightness, that I think it was Freud that ended up fainting during one of their discussions. And Carl Jung had to gently bring him to the couch. So I mean, in terms of, gosh, Moon Pluto, emotions being unlocked, being reformed, going about reforming his self-image. You never know what his past life connection to Freud may have been. So I would also say with the 2nd house, his own self-worth, Pluto Moon, internal security, eliminating emotional dependencies, and so on. And so it was aspected. It was an intention for the life to culminate these things. People he'd been creating relationships with, South Node in Libra, had become secure with, because of his own differing views and because of his own need to psychologically deepen. Pluto's polarity point in Scorpio, 9th house, Saturn in Aquarius in the 1st, sextiling Mars, ruler of that North Node. It's the psychology of individuation. and how he needed to follow his own path to do that. North Node in Aries, second house, Saturn in the first. So those are just my thoughts about his chart. Anybody have any input? Any additional knowledge about Jung?
Hi, David. I'm just noticing the Mercury-Venus skip steps and how they are ruled by the moon, conjunct Pluto. And this would mean repeated mental crisis or disagreements with others. And that seems to be repeated in that natal Pluto signature, conjunct the moon.
Exactly. Thank you, Linda. Yes, exactly. Exactly. And how that became necessary in terms of having to have those conflicts in order to bring about, or in order for him to initiate a new cycle or a new evolutionary path, seeing the North Node being in Aries, Saturn in the first. So it was like the resolution of those skip steps was to not shy away from those at times, but to trust his own vision, because that sixth house could also be hung up in self-doubt, or it could be caught up in insecurity, like because the people who he disagreed with, from my vantage point, were either firmly established or they may have seemed more developed than he himself. So it was like this internal crisis that you were pointing out. But to move forwards, or to develop, to develop his work. And it was almost like the disagreements may have been an igniting point for that. So now looking at Gandhi's chart, I would put him third stage spiritual, at least from my estimations, and seeing that the Pluto-Venus opposition, it's in the gibbous phase, and in that phase, it's like a humbling process, or the gibbous phase can be very much prone to taking in criticism, because it's learning to adjust, or it's learning to uh, harmonize its will with the will of others. It's a Virgo phase. So looking at this, but it's throwing off, also seeing that it's in opposition. And from my understanding, one of Gandhi's deepest teachings was how to correctly use one's will. And looking that this Venus is also conjunct Mars, it's like how to use willpower in its most, I would say, in its rawest form, or in its best. To when you find that you have a lot of, I don't know if you want to call it willful, or it's how to direct willpower. I mean, he was, to bring lightness, he was this little tiny guy, and look what this little tiny guy, he had the British Army just cowering because of the strength of his will and what he was able to encourage other people to do in terms of his advocacy of nonviolence. So Pluto being in Taurus in the 7th retrograde, opposing this Venus-Mars, you can see that through this life, it was activating that willpower in ways that were in most alignment, I would say, with the actualization of personal destiny, seeing the North Node being in the 10th. So how to really accomplish change relative to South Node and Aquarius in the 4th that could last the stretch of time. And I think one of my favorite quotes by him is speaking that no positive outcome can ever come from violence. Violence can only besot violence. So it's really advocating that to see true long-term change, the activation of positive willpower becomes essential. And I really see that again with this Venus-Mars opposition to Pluto. It's like throwing off that tendency to take up the sword, or to fight violence with violence or fire with fire. It's that throwing off. In this lifetime, he was actualizing the message of nonviolence, or of how to affect change through non-cooperation. And that's, I would say, also indicated in the chart is because he also advocated strength of will. It wasn't just allowing anybody to do whatever they wanted, but it was, if something is unjust, do not cooperate. So I believe that when it was like salt was banned because the British were trying to impose a tax or to make more money, you go down to the ocean and you just get the salt. So it was non-cooperation with things that were unjust. So it was promoting a positive strength of will, not to be a doormat. That was really important with the moon, with the gibbous opposition, but how to align one's will through nonviolence and through non-cooperation with what's wrong, with things that are unjust, seeing that Pluto in the 7th house. And seeing the South Node in Aquarius, one theme that may have happened is having trauma relative to family environments. So a potential for having lost a child, having lost family members to violence, seeing the opposition. And again, the tendency, because one is so hurt, so full of pain, can become so beguiled with the need for vengeance, that you can become blind to what's actually just, where you can become blind to what will create long-term change. I believe that there's a story about Gandhi to where a man confessed that he had killed, what was it, a Hindu or a Muslim? They were at odds. And Gandhi, a child, only because he saw him as being on the other side. And so Gandhi said, you take a child that's Hebrew or Hindu or Muslim, and you raise him as your own. It was acting upon what's just, if memory serves. That to me is what really sticks out in the chart in terms of this opposition and how he was able to embody, in my point of view, positive willpower, how to use the will in the best way possible. As you can tell, a very inspirational figure for me. First, he was a lawyer, and seeing this opposition here, when laws are inherently unjust, what do you do then? Seeing this Pluto in the 7th house with Jupiter new phase, both being retrograde, true justice, truly acting upon what's just, what's right. So any additional input or any thoughts about his chart?
Just an observation that just about every planet on the right-hand side of the chart is retrograde, which would also heighten that Venus archetype being redone or revisited and all that kind of stuff.
Absolutely, great observation. Yeah, things being revisited. And looking at this chart too, in terms of affecting change that can be long-lasting in the best way possible, how he himself went on this hunger strike. I really see that as Venus issues too, especially conjunct Mars, that he was going to let himself just waste away until the violence within India or between Muslims and Hindus until it stopped. Or if anybody was using violence, so looking at these like Taurus, Scorpio, the body, he was gonna fight it like that. Yeah, right, as you're saying, counteracting or revisiting that it was a different way to affect change. The retrogrades, individuation as well, seeing the South Node in Aquarius, that from my understanding, this was totally unique or totally revolutionary at the time. And it came through that revisiting, or it came through that redoing, that the individuation or the positives of the retrogrades were able to come out. So then the last example here is Princess Diana, the late Princess Diana. I would put her in the first stage, individuated. And we're seeing this Jupiter in conjunct Pluto. And looking to it, she's also got Mars. Mars in a balsamic conjunction to Pluto. Uranus conjunct North Node. South Node conjunct the Moon. So looking at this, it's really, from my understanding, the crisis around liberating from outdated or outmoded beliefs. Seeing that the in conjunction to Jupiter, Jupiter being in Aquarius retrograde second house, she was creating a lifestyle that essentially entrapped her relative to her own beliefs about survival, worth. As an example of that, when everything started becoming public, and I want to be careful about the way I communicate this, but with Pluto being in the 8th house and Mars there too, she was making habitual choices to sustain the pattern. When all the reporters first started coming, or all the publicity relative to her own belief around what she needed for security, for survival, and so on, that played a factor, because she kept making the choices to sustain that kind of a lifestyle, seeing the Aquarius in the second house. I would also say too that it was through that experience that she came more into touch with her roots, seeing the polarity point being the second house. I would also say with Moon on the South Node in Aquarius in the second house, she started out as a kindergarten teacher. So she has a humanitarian root. Many people know her as the People's Princess, wanting to give to humanitarian causes. That one way that she evoked inspiration was to go to those who were sick and to physically touch, or to touch those who were considered untouchable. Regardless of what it did to her publicity, herself, the image, so on. You can see that with South Node in Aquarius, and also that Pluto in conjunction Jupiter, that it was igniting an essential crisis relative to evaluation. What do I need? What do I not? Seeing the Venus skip step 2 in her chart, how can I make this happen for myself? What do I really value? What do I not? And I mean her commitment to those who are underprivileged, seeing the 8th house, seeing the Pluto Mars in Virgo in the 8th, also seeing the South Node in Aquarius. For children, she was trying to get the mines out, because children were stepping on these mines. So in many ways, you could see how she was shifting to more of a using publicity or using fame, seeing that Taurus in the 5th for humanitarian causes versus personal survival. Venus and Taurus in the 5th, and how it being evoked through these Pluto transits, Pluto Mars, balsamic, bringing about those self-analyses, what needs to be adjusted, coming face to face with her limitations, I'm sure. South Node on Moon, through the loss of her children, cataclysmic event. but at getting her into touch with her essential truth. That's part of that Pluto Jupiter aspect, is to bring one into more of alignments of one's personal truth and what it isn't, and coming out for being a champion of the people, again, the people's princess. One of my favorite quotes by her is, throw out the rule book. I live by the heart, not by the head. Looking at this North Node conjunction to Aquarius and North Node conjunction to Uranus in the 8th, throw out the rule book. Live by the heart, not by the head. And these ways that she had of encouraging us to see positions of fame more as ways to shine light on the underdogs, or to champion those, so to speak, who had a lack of resources. So you can see that skip step 2 being recovered in that light, that she came out. I remember watching a documentary, and she, after going through some very intense experiences, came out saying, I'm a humanitarian figure. And it was very Pluto 8th house. It was definitely a bottom line being communicated. And you could see her own personal transformation happening, in terms of the notoriety, the fame, marrying into privilege, and yet how she reoriented towards that. Venus skip step being recovered, Pluto, Jupiter, and also Mars balsamic. So a lot of evolutionary tension in these charts, a lot of possibilities, potentials for change, which and bringing about things that are quite metamorphic, as all these figures did. Carl Jung, Princess Diana, and so on. That their transformations, or what these Pluto aspects were bringing about, a metamorphosis that was able to bring about collective change in ways that are also setting seeds for time. So we can see too the opportunities to metamorphose, not just personal limitations, but to bring about transformation that's much needed in the collective at any given moment in time. So the opportunities that these Pluto aspects can bring personally and collectively.
I have another question, if it's okay.
Yeah.
I'm trying to intuitively feel the difference between like an opposition, a square, a conjunction, an inconjunct. I know they're all stressful aspects, but I'm kind of trying to understand the difference between them.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to feel it, and I'm having trouble with that part of it.
That's a great question. When we're looking at oppositions, it's a chance to throw something off. So it's typically when things are in a state of extremity or imbalance, and the soul is trying to create a balance, so it can feel that two forces are in inherent conflict, is usually how oppositions are felt, and the need to throw off dynamics that are creating a polarity. With squares, it's tension, or it's a stress. With inconjunctions, it's crisis leading to adjustment. So with squares, it generally creates a tension, or it's putting pressure. When you're looking at conjunctions, it's two things firing at the same time. So when we're dealing with a conjunction, we're going to be experiencing whatever planet is conjuncting Pluto and that planet at the same time. It's firing at the same time. So they induce a level of stress, but the stress is in different areas. Does that help?
Yeah, that helps me a lot. Thank you so much.
Oh, good. Thank you for your question. Any other input or any other questions? Okay, well, I wanted to thank everybody for joining us and for participating. I really appreciate it. Also wanting to wish everyone the best during these very stressful times. Do everything you can to stay well and healthy.
Great. Thank you very much, Deva. Would you all please thank Deva Green, everyone?
Thanks, Deva.
Thank you.
Thank you.